Hi everyone, I'm Jen Petrich. I'm going to be talking to you about word investigations, and this is my third time presenting for the Central Texas Dyslexia Conference. Hope you all are doing well during these interesting times. And so we're going to record this session. It's going to be a little bit different than doing it in person, but I think it'll be okay. And I think that there may be times in here where you can pause and I might give you some other resources to take a look at. And I may make mistakes here and there, but I think I'm just going to keep on going and try and do it in one shot. Hopefully it turns out okay. A little bit of background about myself. Um, I have two children, 10 and 12. One's a fifth grader and one's a seventh grader. My seventh grader has dyslexia, and so does my mother and my brother. So I'm very familiar with dyslexia. And I've been working with students who have dyslexia for over 25 years. I've used lots of programs. I've used different approaches, instructional techniques. I used to do research. I have a PhD in neuroscience, so I used to do brain research. I've looked at linguistics. I've looked at deafness and sign language. I've looked at visual processing. I've done different kinds of research. And I really wanted to go back to doing one-on-one intervention with students because that's what I really miss doing. But I still like the brain, and it still has something to do with how I work with students and understanding their needs and how best to meet their needs. So I have a lot of experience with Orton Gillingham and phonics and explicit and direct instruction, multi-sensory instruction, all that good stuff. So I'm going to throw a little bit of that in, compare and contrast as we go along. But mostly I just really want to teach you about the writing system, how the writing system works and why it's important for anyone who's going to be working with students doing any kind of literacy instruction, that you know how the writing system works and that you know how to investigate it scientifically. That's really the most important piece. So we're going to share and get the presentation started. Okay, so scientific word investigations, the importance of morphology, etymology, and phonology. They all play a very critical role in word investigations, and word investigations are really important in literacy instruction. Reading and writing have to do with the system of print, right? We read it and we write it. So a lot of people, I think, might look at spelling and think, well, you can always use assistive technology if you can't spell that well. But really, it's understanding the writing system that allows us to become skilled readers, that allows us to become effective writers, that allows us to have good reading comprehension, development of vocabulary, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to talk about the roles. What is morphology? What is etymology? What is phonology? And what are their roles in literacy instruction? So a quick outline. First, we're going to have some goals. I'm going to try to kind of talk about where we're going to go, what we want to know, hit those things as we go, and at the end kind of wrap up and make sure that we feel like we've achieved those goals. I'll give you some background. We'll talk a little bit about the brain development and learning. That's one of those places where there's some other webinars that I've done. And if you want to go see a little bit more in depth about that kind of stuff, brain development and learning, there's some other things on the internet you can watch to get some more information. But I'll do a basic review of brain development and learning, the role of linguistics. What is linguistics and what is its role in literacy instruction? What do you need to know about spelling? Like I said, a lot of people kind of look at spelling and they're like, yeah, you can use assistive technology if you can't spell check, it's all good, it's fine, it's really not that important. No, actually it is important. And it's not accurate spelling that's important. It's not about being a perfect speller because no one's a perfect speller. But it's about how we investigate the writing system and what understanding we gain about how the system works by investigating spelling. We'll define some terms, talk a little bit about the science of reading. I want to give you a little bit of background on the history of evolution of English. If you want to, again, study that in depth, there are lots of resources out there. There's classes, there's all kinds of things that you can do to get a more in-depth history and evolution of English, but I think you need to know a little bit about the basics if we're going to talk about etymology and word histories. And then specifically scientific investigation. What do I mean by that, and how do we use that to investigate words? So what is reading? And again, how does that tie into spelling? How are they related? And why is spelling just as important as reading in literacy instruction? A couple more important terms that we'll talk about. What SWI is and is not, right? So structured word inquiry is what it originally started out as. I've heard other kind of terms used, the idea being that we are investigating, it's an inquiry, we're investigating words, and we're doing it in a structured way, but we're also doing it in a scientific way. The scientific method is really important. So we'll talk about what all of that is and what that is not. Talk specifically about scientific inquiry. How do we do that? What tools do we use? And then we're going to kind of investigate a word so that you can see it in action. So what are our goals? We want to answer the following questions. What is the difference between phonics and phonology? This is huge. It is a very important question to understand and to know the answer to. What does linguistics tell us about written language? Linguistics is the study of language. What does it tell us about written language? And why should we use the scientific method to investigate written language? Why is that important? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about linguistics. Linguistics is descriptive. What does that mean? It means that it is looking at words that exist and describing what we see. You can study a word, you can study a word family, you can study the system of word families, you can study across languages, but it's really looking at what language is and how people use it and describing it in terms of the system and the rules that govern the system. Because language is rule governed, all language is rule governed, and so is the writing system. So it's not, I'm going to prescribe these rules on top and say this is the way it works. It's more, let's look at what we've got and how we use it and what can we learn from it. It uses the scientific method, right? Linguistics is a scientific study. So it uses the scientific method, collecting data, creating a hypothesis, evidence for your hypothesis, refining your hypothesis, all that good stuff. And it relies on rigor. It's not about, I have this understanding, and if something doesn't work within that understanding, it's just an exception. Instead, saying there aren't exceptions. So if something doesn't fit my current understanding, then maybe I have to refine my current understanding. That's what rigor is. So knowledge gained from studying across time and across languages. So being able to do that across that big picture view across time and across languages really helps you understand what language is and more about writing systems and how they work, not just specifically English and how English works. And if you are someone who took a foreign language, you probably know that you learn a lot more about your own language when you start learning about another language. As a field, linguistics has existed for over 2,000 years. People have been studying language. Scientifically, really scientifically investigating language, it's been over 300 years. And studying language scientifically offers an understanding. It is not a teaching method or approach. It is, how do we study language so that we get an understanding of the system, how it works, the rules that govern it. That's what we're going to be talking about. So we're not talking about all the things in here you're going to take and do with your students. It's going to give you an understanding, and that's going to inform any teaching that you do. So what do you need to know about spelling? You need to know that our writing system is not speech written down. There are all kinds of writing systems. Some are alphabetic, some are not, and they're not just about speech written down. The purpose of both spoken language and written language is to convey meaning. Phonology, not phonics, is a crucial part of the study of both spoken and written language. So we're going to talk again, remember one of the questions was, what's the difference between phonology and phonics? So we're going to talk about that. And phonology is a crucial part of the study of language. Phonics is not actually based on phonology. Another really important thing to understand when you're talking about spelling and investigating the spelling of words is that letters can be used to represent phonemes. They have other jobs as well. So it's really important, A, to understand what phonemes are, and B, to understand that not every letter in a word is there to represent a phoneme. And this part is crucial. Students who are not able to move past the reliance on sounding out and phonics roles struggle with disfluent reading and poor spelling throughout their schooling. So if you take a student to what I call sound out land, or you create a decoder, we have lots of kids, whether they are dyslexic or whether they're what we would call neurotypical or a typical reader. If you have these kids go into sounding out and decoding and not reading for meaning, um, then you will end up with a slower, inefficient reader and a not very good speller. And it's something that they're going to struggle with. And it's why we probably have such poor outcomes and reading levels. You know, the national report card that came out recently, it was fourth and eighth graders. And if you look at fourth graders across the country, about a third of them are reading at grade level or above. So that other 2/3, not all learning disabled for sure. And even the ones that have reading issues, um, you'll see them get intervention and still kind of plateau at about fourth or fifth grade. Why are they not learning how to read fluently? Why is their comprehension stalling out? Why are they not able to spell? It really has to do with the fact that they're kind of left as a decoder. They never make the jump over into getting meaning directly from print. They're always going through pronunciation. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So let's define some terms. So like we said, what is linguistics? The study of language, but it's the study of all language. So it's not even spoken language or written language, it's also signed languages, right? And so when we study across all those different modalities, we learn a lot about language per se. What exactly is language and what goes on in the brain when we're processing language? So it's the study of all language. Phonology is the study of the psychology of spoken language. Okay, so it's not about what comes out of your mouth, it's about what's in your head. It is a shared representation with all speakers of that language. And it's about what you perceive and what your psychological representations are, not necessarily about what's coming out of your mouth. We'll talk more about it in future slides. Phonetics. So what is phonetics? It's the study of the physiology of spoken language. That is what's coming out of your mouth, right? So we can have an idea in our head of what we think we are pronouncing and how it's tied to the spelling of a word, but we may not always be aware of what's coming out of our mouth. And a lot of times dyslexic kids are much more sensitive to the phonetics that we don't notice because they don't know how to spell and they're really listening to the differences in the sounds that come out of your mouth. They don't have the same psychological representation. So morphology, that's the study of the form and structure of words. Phonics is really a prescriptive literacy instruction based on a small part of speech and psychological research. So it's really looking at spoken language and it's prescriptive. How do I take the spoken language and the written language and put one on top of the other in a prescriptive way? Phonemic awareness is something I find that doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. I think generally people in the literacy world kind of think of it as um, the ability to segment and manipulate the sounds in words. So I think the interesting thing about something like phonemic awareness, there's a couple interesting things. One is that people talk about phonemic awareness without really even knowing what a phoneme is. Um, and also that has become such an important foundational piece that people are teaching phonemic awareness directly without having any association with written language. And even the National Reading Panel in 2000, if you look at the data and the findings that they presented in their report, you find that phonemic awareness really had an effect when it was attached to letters, not just speech. So it's really about the difference in what you hear and how it's linked to the spelling of a word. That's what really matters the most. Um, and I think that, you know, the leap that was taken scientifically was, hey, good skilled readers have good phonemic awareness. So if you give people good phonemic awareness, they'll be good readers. That's not actually the case. And I find that a lot of kids that have had years of intervention, especially phonics-based intervention, they may have good phonological processing. They may have pretty good phonemic awareness as assessed by phonemic awareness measures in the world of reading, but they actually aren't skilled readers. They're not fluent readers. They maybe don't have great comprehension. So they tend to plateau and still struggle. So it's just giving phonemic awareness in a direct and explicit way, especially if it's not linked to letters and spelling, is not going to get the student where they need to go to become a skilled reader by itself. And orthographic phonology. What is orthographic phonology? It's the study of the connection between graphemes and phonemes. So that is the goal of phonics-based instruction for sure. And a lot of times people call them GPCs now, right? So grapheme phoneme correspondences. But that really should be the goal of any literacy instruction. You do want to understand the relationship between graphemes and phonemes. But in doing that, you should really have an understanding of graphemes and phonemes, an accurate understanding that comes from linguistics. And you need to understand, like I said before, not all letters spell phonemes. So not every letter in a word is a grapheme. So you have to understand what is the job of these other letters that are in words. And also in English, there are lots of different graphemes for each phoneme. And there's different phonemes that go with each grapheme sometimes. So how do you know which graphemes to choose? Or how do you know which phonemes your graphemes are representing? And that's where a lot of the other pieces of the investigation come into play and are actually much more important than how the word's pronounced. So let's look at what is a phoneme. It is a psychological representation of speech units spelled by a grapheme and distinctive for meaning. So examples, pat and bat. Pat and bat are exactly the same, except the beginning is voiced or voiceless, right? So the voiceless is p, so that's pat, and the voiced is b, that's bat. They are different words and they mean different things. But you could have something like an unaspirated T and an aspirated T. So you could have something like hit and hit. That's a phonetic difference. There is a difference between hit and hit. You can hear the difference, but it's not distinctive for meaning in English. It is distinctive, or it can be distinctive in other languages, but for us, it's not distinctive. So an unaspirated T or a T are not different phonemes for us. So what is a grapheme? So it's a psychological representation of writing units that spell a phoneme. So it can be a letter, it can be more than one letter, it can be a digraph or a trigraph. And again, it's a psychological representation of the writing units, right? So you can have an idea of a grapheme and it can be realized in different ways. Some examples of graphemes in words. So if we have the word the, we have two graphemes. We have the digraph th and we have the e. In light, we have three graphemes. We have the o spelled by the l, the I spelled by the IGH, and the t spelled by the t. In the word cheese, if you've, I think it's, I don't know if it's easy to see, but there's here, this E is kind of grayed out a little bit. That's because that's not a grapheme. So the CH is a grapheme, the double E is a grapheme, and the S is a grapheme. That E has a job, but it is not a grapheme. It's not representing a phoneme. Same with the word to. The W is kind of grayed out because that is not a grapheme. That is a marker. And if we talk about it a little bit later in the presentation, the word to has a marker. Why does it have a marker? Why is it there? Where did it come from? And why do we continue to spell that word that way? And then morphemes, psychological representations of the meaningful units that make up words. So an example, and what I mean by like a psychological representation. So if you think about plurals, right? How do you spell a plural? Well, there's lots of different ways. The default would be an S or an ES, and there's reasons why we use an ES versus an S. But even the way that the S is pronounced is not always the same. So we have cats and dogs, and then we have bushes, right? So we have different um, phonological representations of a plural and even different spellings, but they're still the same kind of morphemic representation of a plural. So let's talk a little bit about the science of reading and why that matters in what we're going to talk about when we compare um, a phonics-based instruction to SWI. So Seidenberg and McClellan quite a while ago had a connectionist model, the triangle model. And you can see here that we've got semantics, we've got orthography, and we've got phonology. And those are all different nodes, and they're all interconnected, and they're all related to context. So there's different parts of the brain that subserve all of these things, but they're all interrelated. So if we want to kind of look at how are they interrelated in the brain, let's take a look at that model. So this is Max Coltart. This is quite a while ago, but my understanding is people still kind of think of this dual root connectionist model as the way that reading works. It's overlaid on top of a picture of a brain. These pathways are not where they are in the brain. We'll talk about that in the next slide. But this is just the idea of what's happening and the different pathways that you can use to get to meaning, right? So we start with print, and then you have a part of your brain that interprets the visual features of the word, and then you get to letter units and processes those. And it can either go down this way to the grapheme phoneme rule system, which is what we were talking about, those GPCs, right? Decoding and translating the graphemes into phonemes, then going to the phoneme system and then to speech. And that would give you an articulation of the word. Notice there's no meaning over on this side. Over on the other side, you still have the same kind of visual analysis that goes on. Then you go to what they call the orthographic input lexicon. So you have an area of your brain, there's a word form, a visual word form area, and you kind of have these visual representations of the orthography stored. And those have direct access to the semantic system. So when you are processing these orthographic forms, you are activating the meaning directly from the print. You can also consequently, and maybe even automatically, activate the phonological output lexicon. And so you get the phonology of the word. And if you wanted to say it out loud, you could, but you don't have to, and you don't rely on that to get to the meaning. Whereas if you go this other way, you get to the phonological representation of the word, but you've got to go through that to get to the meaning. So when you're sounding out, you're relying on the pronunciation to activate the meaning. That is a very laborious, slow, inefficient route. It's where most people begin. Not everybody begins that way, but it's where most people begin to read. And eventually you want to switch over. You want to develop this other direct pathway, direct access to meaning from print. That's the fast route. There's lots of different words or labels for these routes. Sometimes this is called the ventral route. This is called the dorsal route. I'll show you why on the next picture. Sometimes it's called deep and shallow. Sometimes it's called phonological versus orthographic. There's all different kinds of labels for the two different routes. But the idea being that this is very slow and inefficient, and this is how people tend to start out, but you really want to switch over to this other pathway. So here are the basic brain areas. This is a brain looking to the left. The eyes would be over here. This is the back of the head. Your primary visual areas are here. So visual information comes in and gets processed here first. This is your auditory processing areas. All auditory information comes here. Sensory information comes up here. This is motor information. This is motor planning. Up front is where we have executive function skills. So that takes a lot of the input and decides what your response is going to be. And then back here we have, these are called integration areas. So we've got some auditory information, we've got some visual information, we may have some other information from these other input areas, and that's where a lot of it is integrated. So when you're talking about the ventral and dorsal root, so the ventral root is using these visual areas in the visual word form area to access meaning directly. Whereas the slower root uses the auditory, uses, this isn't labeled here, but there's some articulatory and phonological representations up here. Some, they call it Broca's area. Sometimes when you look at fMRI studies of dyslexic readers, you will see a lot of overactivation in this area, in this frontal area. And then you have to get to some semantics to meaning through there. So as we're developing these pathways, what's important to think about? So how do we learn? How does the brain learn? How do we develop these pathways? So we learn by experience. So when you're born, you have all of these connections between your neurons, and you, as you get experiences, some of those connections are strengthened, and as you don't have certain experiences, then you lose other connections. So it's a use it or lose it kind of thing. If you use it, the connections get stronger. If you don't, they get weaker. And the goal is to build neural networks. So you want to build these networks of connected cells that when they are activated together, they call it, when they fire together, they wire together. So you want to have these connected networks. And that is where the idea really that multisensory instruction is so important comes from. So here's just a picture of neurons in the brain, and they have these little processes that come out and connect to each other. And then they have these tails that kind of, when the neuron fires, it sends a signal down the tail, down to other ones. And so they're connected. There's this network. And so when we want to build this, we want to use multisensory instruction. So we want to have tactile or sensory input. We want to have motor input. We want to have auditory input. We want to have visual input. And when you think about multisensory instruction and what it is, and what it is, especially when it comes to literacy instruction, you want to make sure that you're really thinking about using the different modalities and different ways of storing information. So when you're talking about print, right, you can see print and you can write print. You can also spell out words. So that's another way to kind of input orthographic information, is by spelling it out. And then obviously you can then hear the words and hear when you're spelling it out. So you can use all of that information to encode related information together in these networks. So it's really important to do multi-sensory instruction. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of, like I said, writing is huge. We're not writing enough, right? A lot of kids are learning how to type without even learning how to write. And that motor input is very different than typing. So there's plenty of studies that show college students that take notes, handwritten notes, they retain a lot more information than typing. And that's mostly because typing all feels the same. When you're writing, you're actually encoding the letters, and it feels different. So mastering writing is really important. It's not something you want to skip. If a child is having trouble mastering it, then that means you need to change the way that you're teaching it. We don't just skip it. So what are some other important facts about spelling that we need to know before we start investigating? So like I said, written language, not the spoken language written down. The primary goal of written language is to represent meaning, not pronunciation. And if you think about it, speech is thought made audible, right? So these ideas that I have in my head, I'm going to say, and then you can hear them. Spelling is just thought made visible. So if I want someone to be able to see the thoughts that I have and understand them with their eyes, then I can write them down. Which is why actually writing is important, because if we want to be able to express ourselves clearly in the visual modality, we need to be able to write effectively. And most importantly, spelling makes sense. So remember, we talked about the system and investigating it scientifically, descriptively, understanding the rules. And when we run into something that doesn't match the understanding that we have, then we have to rethink our understanding. I mean, this is how kind of science and medicine work all the time, right? So we have an understanding, we get new information, it doesn't really fit with our understanding. Maybe we need to kind of refine our understanding and come up with a different way that we think things work. So let's do a brief walk through the history and evolution of English. And I put there's always a reason. And what that means is there's always a reason a word is spelled the way it's spelled. We may not always be able to immediately get to that reason. And sometimes it might take looking across, having that bird's eye view and looking across a lot of our word investigations to be able to see it. But there's always a reason a word is spelled the way that it's spelled. So let's talk a little bit about spoken versus written language, right? So like I said, speaking is how we get meaning from our brain into other people's brains via their ears. That is serial. That is one sound after another. That's how our brain processes speech. Writing is how we get meaning from our brain into others' brains via their eyes, and it is not serial. A skilled reader sees visual information in parallel all at one time. They are able to process the whole word. Now, there's a lot of studies that look into, fixations, eye fixations, how much you see at one time, perceptual span. So we tend to fixate in a spot and we see a little bit to the left and we see a lot to the right because when we read left to right. If you read the other way, you read a language that goes from right to left, your perceptual span will be shifted that way. So you'll see a little bit to the right, but you see a lot more to the left. And everyone's span's going to be different. If you, there's an average span, but there's going to be variety, right? If you're reading something that is dense, in terms of the material, the content, your perceptual span may actually shrink. Obviously, it has to do with the font size too. But this idea that you're getting everything in parallel and your brain is processing the whole structure at one time. When you are taught to sound out, you kind of teach the brain to do it visually in a serial fashion. And if you've worked with a lot of dyslexic students or kids that are struggling with reading, you might find that they tend to start to sound out and then kind of guess the rest. They don't really seem to process the ends of words. And I think that typically comes from years of instruction of always starting at the beginning and sounding out and not having any practice of actually looking at the whole word. So with the history of English, I sometimes, when I give talks, I try to ask people how old they think English is. And you get kind of a wide range of answers between a few hundred years old to a few thousand years old. If you ask kids, sometimes you'll even get like a million years old because they really have no sense of time and why English wouldn't have been around forever. But if you look at where English actually started, okay, let's go back just a little bit before that. So here's the height of the Roman Empire, and you can see the Romans went everywhere. They went in all directions, and they conquered all of these different areas. So the height of the Roman Empire, about 117 AD, it's huge, and it's all the way up into what is now England. So what happens? The Roman Empire starts to fall. By around 410, the Romans are not in charge here anymore. So it leaves space for some other people to come in. So I have 400, really, this should probably be more like 450. We get Anglo-Saxons coming in. So the Anglo-Saxons are people from around here. We've got these different groups of Germanic tribes that come over. The Angles, the Saxons, that's where Anglo-Saxon comes from. The Frisi, the Jutes, they all come over and they start taking some land, and their languages, though a little bit different, start to intermingle. And then later, I have this in the same thing, it should really be two separate things, but so 450, 500, you start getting the Anglo-Saxons. By 700, you start getting Vikings. They start coming down. They are Norse. They are Norsemen from, they speak Old Norse. We call it Old Norse at the time. I'm sure they didn't call it Old Norse because they didn't know that it was the old form. But we call it now Norway. All of those things have to do with north, right? Those were people from up north. So they come down speaking their language, also a Germanic language, but different. And we get a lot of language interaction. And there are certain rules about what happens to language when there's contact like that. And but that's the beginning of Old English, right? So we've got the Anglo-Saxons and what they're speaking. That is the first version of English. And then we get a lot of influence from the Vikings when they come, and the Old Norse kind of mixing in and changing the system a little bit. The next big thing that happens is the Battle of Hastings. So in 1066, some of you may remember that date. I know I remembered 1066 and I remembered Battle of Hastings, but I didn't remember at all what it was. Now I know it is William the Conqueror coming over into England, bringing his French speaking buddies and bringing French over, and it becomes the kind of official language in court and in documents. And it's kind of a Germanic French because the people who were living in this area actually had ancestors that were also Vikings that came down. They have ancestors from around here, and so it's more of a Germanic French, and that's what they bring over. And so we get this incredible mixing of the English and the French. English kind of goes underground a little bit. You know, peasants are still kind of speaking it, but you don't have any official proceedings in English. You don't have a lot of reading and a lot of writing in English. So this period then becomes Middle English. So if anyone's ever talking about Old English, that's that very beginning period. After the French comes in, that gives us our Middle English period. And then we get Caxton bringing over the printing press. So some important things to think about with the printing press. I don't know, again, if you all remember learning about this in school. I did. Gutenberg Bible, the printing press. I remember that. Didn't know why that was so important. But now, in the context of language study, I find all of this history much more interesting and relatable than I did as a kid. But anyway, so with the printing press, it was a big shift because now you've got any kind of writing. If you want a copy of it, everyone's going to get the same copy. They're all going to get a printed copy off the printing press. Before that, if you had translations of things or you had copies of things that you needed, you had scribes do it. So you had people who knew French, who knew English, who usually knew some Latin and Greek, and they were the ones writing it. And so some things happened to the writing system then. So we had French speakers sometimes changing the spellings because of their language and their influence. So if they didn't have a can't do it very well, sound in the back of your throat that they had in Old English. They spelled it with an H in Old English. They spelled it with a GH in French. Then you end up getting this like IGH construction that we have, right? So RIGHT used to be something like Richt. It had a in it. That disappeared, but the GH is still there. And so you had scribes making these sometimes systematic changes, sometimes not. Sometimes they might see something another scribe didn't notice. And so maybe your copy that you got from one scribe had some different spellings. Sometimes there might even be different spellings within the same work. But it was really reliant on those scribes and their influence and their knowledge of Latin or their knowledge of Greek or their knowledge of French that kind of affected the spellings. Then we get to the printing press, and now the printers are going to affect the spelling. So there are some rules and ideas that the printers had that kind of changed the spellings and how they worked. And when we get to stress in English, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that also happened in terms of how certain words we stress in English. How would you stress that in print? So we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to that point. And then the next really big event would be Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language. So if you think, I mean, often I talk to students about these kind of things, and if you think about, you know, what was it like reading and writing before you had dictionaries? So for a while, I think probably maybe a couple hundred years at least before this dictionary, there were some dictionaries, but often they were of higher level words. And this was the first dictionary that was encompassing. It had all of the words in English, and it was how the words are actually used in English. And for sure, there were some changes that were made by Samuel Johnson when he did this dictionary. But here's another thing to kind of standardize the language. So the printing press now, every copy you get looks the same. The dictionary now, you want to look up a word and you want to know how to spell it, you have a place to go. Now you have a standardization of those words and how they're spelled. Okay, so we've got the original Anglo-Saxons and the way they spoke and the way they wrote. Then we've got influence of the Norse, Old Norse coming in from the Vikings. Then we've got this huge influence of French in Middle English and changed the way that a lot of things were done. We've got changes or influences from the scribes, from the printing press, from dictionaries, right? So we've got lots of things going on in terms of the influences on English. And then one thing I didn't mention is the influence of Latin and Greek, right? So a lot of the Latin influence is via French. So words went from Latin into French and then into English when the French came over into England. And then later, you have like during the Renaissance period and a lot of discoveries and inventions and new words being coined, math, science, medicine, those tend to be Latinized Greek. So we have Greek words that they spelled with the Roman alphabet and coined using those pieces. So you see a lot of that when you investigate it, words that come from those fields. And you also have some influence of Greek if the words that we got from French, that they got from Latin, that they got from Greek. So how are we going to investigate the writing system scientifically, and why are we going to do it that way? So let's talk a little bit about what it means to read and how there's a relationship between reading and spelling, right? Because like I said, spelling is kind of, I don't know if it's the redheaded stepchild. That's what a lot of people like to say, that phrase, right? But it's just kind of forgotten about and left out. And today it's not that important, but actually it is, because the writing system, print, is what we read and what we write. So they are both really important to understanding the system and for your brain to understand the system. So what does it mean to read? Does it mean to sound out and pronounce words? Well, reading aloud adds a cognitive load. If you ask skilled readers to read aloud, even just very skilled readers, good reading comprehension, they've never had a problem with reading. If you ask them to read aloud, you'll still see quite a continuum of ability, right? And there are always going to be people who would love to read out loud, and there's always going to be people saying, please don't ask me to read out loud, because it adds a cognitive load. And so some brains just aren't very good at it. And more, I'm starting to think, why are we assessing kids by having them read aloud anyway? That's not the goal. The goal is to read to yourself and understand. That's really what we want. That's what we should be looking at. And so when you're having somebody read aloud, you're adding this huge cognitive load. Also, if you're focusing on sounding out, you can obscure meaningful structures. So if you're really only looking at that grapheme to phoneme correspondence, you're not processing the whole word, you're not seeing the structure, and a lot of times you're missing out on a lot of the meaningful pieces in the word. And you can pronounce without gaining meaning. So I have several students who have been able to decode their way through school, and people think they're reading, and then come to find out when they get older and they hit a wall, they're not understanding what they're reading. So they're able to pronounce and they're able to decode, but they're not actually getting meaning out of the word. So is it gaining meaning from print? Well, we can get meaning without pronouncing a word. So you can see a word and see the meaningful pieces and actually know what it means, even if you don't know how to pronounce it. So focusing on meaning and structure and the history helps us understand spelling and why words are spelled the way they're spelled and how the system works. So then let's talk about spoken syllables versus written syllables. If you look at a word like action, you can look at the spoken syllables, action, or you can look at the written syllables and the meaningful pieces of the word, in which you can see an ACT and an ION. Which analysis is more meaningful? Does ac mean something? Does shun mean something? Does ACT mean something? For sure, ACT has meaning. And we can see that action is related to act both in its structure and if we think about what it means. So instead of thinking about, hey, look at this word and the way it's spelled, why do we say it this way? Let's shift that and let's think, why do we spell it this way? So if there's something that you feel like is not matching up, instead of thinking about, well, why is that word pronounced that way? Well, it's pronounced that way because you want people to understand what you're saying, and that's how we pronounce it. Language evolves over time. and pronunciations evolve, and even spellings evolve. So it's just evolved to be pronounced that way. That's just the way it is. That's language, right? That's innate spoken language, and that's how it evolves. But the question is, why do we spell it the way we spell it? And so when we're analyzing these words, and we do want to look at the meaningful structures and we want to look at the pronunciation, but we want to make connections via word families, and those word families are going to be based on structure and meaning, not on pronunciation. So here's an example. You see the ACT in all of these words, and if you think about what these words mean, you can see how they're related, both in meaning and in form. But if you think about how they're pronounced, act and ax, if you say ax, most kids, if you say it out of context, would probably think you're saying AX or AXE, depending on how you spell it. It's pronounced very differently when you put that S on the end, but you can see the ACT. Acted. If you say acted and you have kids who don't know how to spell, try and sound that out from their phonics instruction, you're probably going to get ACDID, because what they're hearing sounds to them like a D in the middle, acted. So no matter how you pronounce the T in these words, or how different parts of these words are pronounced, we can see the connection in the form, and we understand the connection in the meaning. Now, those are all pretty familiar forms with some pretty common suffixes, but you can even have some higher level forms, and you can still see the ACT in all of those words, and you can investigate them, see how they've evolved over time, and see the pieces. Then you have an ACT, and all you're doing is changing prefixes and suffixes. And that's how you can see that a shun is not a thing. It is a spoken syllable, but it is not a meaningful structure. Neither is tiv, right? It's an ACT with an IVE, or an ACT with an ION. Why does actually have two L's? Because it's an AL and it's an LY. When you are able to look at those different parts of the word, the form and structure, the meaning, you get an understanding of why it's spelled the way it's spelled that you cannot get just from sounding it out. Okay, so phonology is important, very important. It's just not the most important, right? So in phonics, you have this idea of phonological primacy, that is what is most important. And something like homophones becomes a real problem when you're just sounding out, right? Why do we even have homophones? If everything is supposed to just be written the way that it sounds and you're supposed to be able to sound out, why do we have homophones? Well, if you ask a kid, why do I have the word IN and the word INN or INN? Why do I have two different words in? They will tell you because they're two different words or because they have different meanings. It's very obvious to them that they're separate words that mean separate things, so we have separate spellings. That is, something that is amazingly intuitive to any student that I've ever talked to. And so the homophone principle is about how if we have words that are that mean different things, they're going to be spelled differently if possible. And that way you can see, when you see the word, you can recognize what the word is and what the meaning is. And it has nothing to do with the pronunciation. So do we really have sight words, right? So sight words tend to come up. I mean, I feel like I've heard them used two different ways. So either it's a word that you recognize right away by looking at it, or it's a word that you have to memorize because it doesn't follow the phonics rules. And again, that's where we run into, well, are they really accurate rules if we have a bunch of words that don't fit them? So do we really have sight words? Do we really have words that we just have to memorize? Or is it that we're not studying them the right way? So if you look, remember I said before about the W and two, why is there a W and two? If you actually look at the history of the word, the W was pronounced in Old English. It was twa. And so that's why it's there. It's always been there. And it was pronounced. It's not pronounced anymore. So why is it still there? Well, again, we don't spell based on the pronunciation. But let's think through it. If we took the W out, we'd have TO. That's already a word. If we use two O's, that's already a word. Even if you wanted to spell oo with an OE, like shoe, TOE is already a word. Now, when you have a lot of kids have trouble spelling this word, a lot of times they want to spell it TOW because they know OW is a thing. and or they hear a w at the end of to, right? And so that's where they come up with the OW. But if you take a look at the history of the word and you look at its relatives, you find words like twin, twice, 12, 20, between. They all have TWs. You can hear the W in all of those words. So it's clear why there's a W there. It was always there and why we didn't get rid of it. You don't have to memorize it. And after you find that connection, you always know why the W is there and where it goes. One of the other really important things to understand is schwa. So when we're talking about phonology, we do need to talk about schwa, but we need to really understand schwa and what it is. So in spelling, schwa becomes a real problem. As an example here, I have different. Why do we spell different, D-I-F-F-E-R-E-N-T, and not D-I-F-R-E-N-T? There's a schwa in the word different, and you can see it here. I have it marked here. It's an int. So kids might actually spell it with an INT if they don't know about ENT. You can't sound out a schwa. Any vowel can be a schwa, and you have no idea. It's really only understanding the meaning, the structure, and the history that you can understand why any vowel is picked for a schwa. But you also have these words like different where this middle guy has totally dropped out. But if we, well, and so we'll talk about that a little bit more later. I'll leave that for our investigation. But let's talk a little bit more about schwa. Oh, where's my schwa thing? Oh, it's at the very end of this, sorry. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about sight words. So with sight words, what does phonics or OG instruction that's based on phonics do with sight words? So we look at high frequency words. We try to make sure that kids have memorized their high frequency words and can read them automatically. We do a lot of flashcards and drilling. We might look at Dolch and Fry lists. We talk about words that don't play fair. So we have these rules, and if they don't follow those rules, they don't play fair. And what do you have to do? You have to memorize them. So not only is this a lot of memorizing, for kids that have dyslexia, kids that have reading struggles, memorizing is actually not something they're very good at. It takes a lot more repetition for them to memorize. So it's really the worst strategy to give for what to do with these words. But instead, what if we talk about function words and content words? So before I asked about the IN and the INN. Why do we have those two spellings? Because they're two different words. Why do we have two N's in the one, the INN, the in that's like a hotel? Because that's a content word. So in English, we have stress, and stress really helps us pull out the content words in a sentence. The words in the sentence that are most important have most of the meaning. Those tend to have weightier spellings. That's one of the things I was talking about before with like the printing press and printers, and they found ways to make words look heavier, have more stress in text. And so one of the ways is to give them more letters. So the function words will always have less letters than the content word. Function words don't have to follow the same rules that content words do. You will see the double, like an in, like egg. Why does egg have two G's? It's a content word, so it gets two G's. Sometimes you'll see an E on the end, like dye, the Easter egg dye, DY would work, but it's DYE because it's a content word. Content words tend to have 3 or more letters, whereas function words can have any number of letters, but they tend to take smaller spellings and don't always have to follow the rules. And if we have conversations about that, we actually understand a lot of the exceptions, because really what's happening is a lot of the times when you have something like a TCH or you have something like a CK or you have something like that, that a word is not using that spelling, there's always a reason why. A lot of times it's because it's a function word, so it doesn't need the extra letters. So also instead, let's investigate the morphology and the etymology along with the phonology. And then we understand why a word is spelled the way it is, and it doesn't have to just be something we memorize as a sight word. And this is where I'm going to head over into the schwa, right? So we want to teach the schwa, and we want to teach it accurately. We want to make sure we have an accurate understanding of schwa, and teach it explicitly and directly. So English is a stress-timed language. What does that mean? It means that some of our syllables are longer than others. Some of our syllables get more stress. And like I said, it's the important, meaningful words in the sentence, those content words, those lexical words, those get stressed so that our ears can pull those out of the sentence and we get more meaning from them. The Romance languages are not stress time, they're syllable time. So every syllable has the same amount of stress. If we do that in English, if we spoke every syllable with the same amount of stress, this is how it would sound. And it sounds a little bit robotic, but it also actually takes us longer to understand because we don't have the stress on the content words like we're used to. So what ends up happening is you get schwas, right? So you have unstressed syllables, and schwa only occurs in an unstressed syllable. It is an unstressed vowel. It is not a. There are a lot of programs and a lot of tutors out there that tell you that schwa is a. It is not a. A is stressed. That is a short U and it is stressed. It would be the difference between up and upon. It's not up on, it's upon, right? It's a schwa. It's not a. The schwa doesn't always sound exactly the same in words. So you could have a schwa that sounds a little bit more like an I or an eh or an but it's tiny, it's barely there. You don't really have to move your mouth, and it's not stressed. And again, impossible to spell by sounding out. Any vowel can be a schwa anywhere. And I find there are some rules I've heard of. Things like if you have a schwa in the beginning or the end of a word, it's likely to be an A. If you have a schwa in the middle of a word, it's likely to be an I. And those things are so not accurate. And there's kind of a difference between production and perception here. So being able to produce the schwa is not the same thing as being able to hear it. And I think that anyone is able to hear it if they're able to produce it, but you may not be aware of it. So it may take a lot of, like I said, direct and explicit instruction to be able to understand where schwas are and be able to hear them when you're talking about the phonology of the word. Oh, well, that timing didn't work out right, huh? Sorry about that. So what is SWI? So it's a method of investigating words, right? That's what SWI is. It is a set of tools to create an understanding of the writing system. And it is a way to learn about critical thinking and the scientific method. So all of those things are really important and kind of the crux of what we're doing. We're investigating words, we're following a method of doing it. We have these tools that we can use to create an understanding of the writing system, and we want to think about it critically and use the scientific method. It is not a curriculum. It is not a scope and sequence. It is not a method of instruction. So a lot of times I hear these arguments, especially in the groups that talk about the science of reading, and they talk about data and they talk about effective instruction. And most of the time they're talking about, like I said, the method of instruction, right? What curriculum are you using and how are you delivering it? That's not what SWI is about. SWI is about how do we investigate language, and what the understanding that you're trying to get is based on linguistics, right? So what do we know about language based on linguistics and what it tells us? So there's lots of research about that. And so when we look at the writing system and the orthography and how the writing system works and how all writing system works, that is determined by scientific study, by linguistics. That information is out there. And so when somebody says this is how the writing system works, it's how the writing system works. Now, what do you want to do with that information and how are you going to use it in your teaching? That's a separate question. And that is what a lot of the science of reading people are looking at, right? They're looking at implementation and instructional methods. But that's not what SWI is about. And specifically, when you're talking about phonics, there's all kinds of things that are taught in a phonics-based instruction or phonics-based curriculum that are not linguistically accurate. So let's just talk about science in general, science inquiry. What are our steps? We're going to collect data and evidence, right? That's huge. That's what we want to do. Why are we doing that? We're going to do that because we want to develop a hypothesis. After we develop a hypothesis, we're going to test it. We want to see if our hypothesis has support or not. If it doesn't, then maybe we need to refine our hypothesis, right? If we collect more data and we find that it doesn't fit our hypothesis, you could have something you're like, okay, here's my hypothesis. I got some data. Hey, it supports my hypothesis. That's great. A little while later, you get some other evidence, some new data, and you go, that actually doesn't fit with my hypothesis. Then that means you need to revisit your hypothesis and refine it. That's how science works. It's okay. And I see a lot of schools that are STEM certified and they use the engineering process, and you even hear like in sports analogies and all kinds of places where you talk about failing and you talk about learning from failure, right? It's the same kind of thing. When you don't find support or you find something that doesn't match your hypothesis, that's how it works. You learn from that, you refine it, and you move on. So how do we apply this to written language? So we investigate semantics. We look at the meaning of the word. Then we hypothesize about the morphology, right, which is the form or the structure. So we try and see what we can see and see if we have a hypothesis about the morphology. We can test our hypothesis by looking at the etymology. Where does that word come from? Does it have relatives? Does it have words that look kind of the same, that have the same history? Then we can look at the orthographic phonology. Then we can look at the relationship between the parts of the word that are the graphemes and the phonemes they spell, and what's the relationship. And maybe there's something new there that we haven't seen before. And if we run into something that doesn't agree with our current understanding, then we can investigate and revise our hypothesis if we need to. And that's actually key, right? Because I find that many people in the world of literacy go to a workshop or go to a talk and they take what the person said as fact and run with it. And this is a little bit different. You don't understand something because someone told you. That could be the beginning of your understanding, but your understanding is going to be deeper and last longer, first of all, if you figure it out yourself, but also you just have a current understanding. Whatever it is, wherever you got it, that's your current understanding. If you run into something that doesn't match, then you have to figure out why, right? So it doesn't mean, well, that person told me this and they're wrong. It means maybe their current understanding, they hadn't run into that data before. So then if you run into that data, then you get to update and refine your current understanding. It happens all the time, and it should happen. So there's 4 questions that we use to go through this process. The first question is, what does it mean? The second and third question can be interchanged depending on how much data or evidence you already have. So how is it built, and what are its history and relatives? So how is it built is looking at the structure and the morphemes in the word. And do you see the structure? Do you see things you can peel off? Do you see a base that you recognize? You may have a hypothesis about a word before you've even studied much about it, but you may not. So you may want to look at the history and relatives first. Then what can we learn from its pronunciation? So what are the tools that we're going to use to follow this method? So first, we're going to have a new perspective, right? It's not why do we say it that way, but why do we spell it that way? And with that, we are not going to say a word and have you guess the spelling by the pronunciation, okay? No one can know what a spelling is if they've never seen the word before. Can you guess it correctly? Sure. Could you have a hypothesis based on other things you know about other words? Sure. But can you know the actual spelling if you've never seen it? No. And so this idea of I'm going to say some sounds and you're going to guess how to spell it is such a backwards way of looking at spelling. Instead, I'm going to give you a word. We're going to look at it. I'm going to tell you what the word is, and then we're going to investigate the spelling. We're going to use our 4 questions. We're going to use word sums. So we're going to look at how we can represent the word visually in its morphemes. And we're going to use the word sums to help us with our rigor. We're going to have to use coherent word sums to show what we know about the structure of a word. We can use matrices. Matrices are a really nice way of visualizing a whole word family. They don't have to be exhaustive. It doesn't have to have every form of the word that uses that base, but of the words that we know, we can put them all in this representation. And not only is it really a way to take our word sums and put them all together in one visual representation, but these are great to use for spelling. If you were to present a word family during the week and have the kids build a matrix from the word families that you've studied, And then at the end of the week, they have to spell words using their matrix. It's a perfect way to do like a spelling test. So it's not about memorizing the form. It's about, can you take the pieces that we've studied and put them together to make the words? And then there's online resources that I'll talk about that that'll be at the end of the presentation that we use. So let's do it. So let's investigate a word. So let's take different. That was earlier on. We were talking about different and how it might be kind of a struggle for students to spell because there's a schwa and there's also what we would call a zero schwa that's not even pronounced, that you don't even know it's there, right? So how do you know that E in the middle is there? So let's just talk about what it means. So it means not the same as another or each other, unlike in nature, form, or quality, or distinct or separate. When it comes to definitions, sometimes we look up definitions. A lot of times it's best just to ask the student, do you know this word? Could you use it in a sentence? Making up definitions are for words, unless they're concrete nouns, sometimes it's a very difficult thing to do. So a lot of times you might just say, hey, could you use it in a sentence? Okay, so let's take a look at how we think it might be built. So maybe we have a hypothesis. So I put a question mark because, hey, I think I see an ENT that I've seen before at the end, but I definitely see DIFFER. That's the word differ. And I know differ is related to different. So that's my hypothesis about the structure. So let's look at the history. Oh, I forgot to change this. Dang it. That's supposed to say different. All right, so pretend that's different. On the handouts, I'll fix it. But there's different. So what is the history of the word different? So here is a whole long entry that you would find in Etymology, the etymological dictionary. And there's even a whole class on how to use the etymological dictionary, but I'll kind of walk you through a little bit of it. So it comes into English in the late 14th century. And when it came into English, this is what it meant. Not the same, unlike, dissimilar, etc., etc. Now we're going to walk backwards through the history of the word. So it came from Old French. Here's the Old French word. Looks exactly the same, probably pronounced differently, but it looks the same. From Latin, here's your Latin form. Okay, still looks very similar, has a little piece on it, Latin suffix, what it meant in Latin. And then it says past participle of, and so here's a different form in Latin, and it meant to set apart. It says from assimilated form of, here's your DIS, okay? And this is actually easier to read in Etymology. When I pasted it, I lost some of the italic, some of the formatting. It's easier to see, but this DIS is a prefix, and you've probably noticed the DIS as a prefix before, meaning apart or away from. But it says it has an assimilated prefix in this word, and it says it's that plus this Latin word to bear or carry. So literally meaning to carry apart or carry away from. And if we look at difference and we think about, we had an ENT and we took that off and we had differ. So there's not a DIS, but there's a DIF and there is an FER in there. So maybe that's the structure. So let's take a look at, are there relatives that maybe have that FER also? So we're going to revisit our structure. Here's our Latin root. Okay, so maybe the base is FER. So maybe it's this. So maybe we have this DIF and this FER, and then we have an ENT. So can we find some relatives that have that same FER piece, that have that same history? That would be our evidence for this base. And again, sorry, ignore that. That's supposed to be different. So we have differ, and so we think here this is the structure. Differently, okay, so that would be the same word we had, just putting an ly on the end. But then we find the word refer. If you go look up in the etymology, look at the etymological history of the word refer, you will find it has that same Latin root FERRE, and it has that same FER in it. Oh, that's another typo. RE, that should be an RE. So RE, FER, and it has a different suffix, ENCE. Now we have referred, referee, conference. So we still have that FER, same history, same Latin root, same base. Preference, suffering. So you can see quite a large word family, lots of relatives that have that FER piece that came from the same place. So what can we learn from its pronunciation? So let's take a look at the word different and what do we have going on. So it said it was an assimilated prefix. So we have this piece in front where this is actually just there to match this. So instead of an S, it's an F. So it's not really there to spell something, it's just there to match this. And then in the middle, we have that zero schwa, where that's not spelling anything. And then we have our schwa here in our suffix. So we know it's an ENT. So even though it's an nt could be spelled different ways. We know that this one is an ENT. And if you notice, well, I can't remember, maybe we'll see if it pops up in another word that's on this. If not, I'll go back and look. But there's a relationship between this ENT and another suffix. And then we see this kind of not being pronounced. All right, so let's look at refer. So we have another schwa here, and then we have our and our f. And then this guy is a stressed version of So you can have an unstressed and a stressed version of So in refer, it's stressed. I'm putting the stress on the refer. In refer, which you could hear would have the stress in the front, and then the second part would be a schwa plus an R. But in this one, it's stressed. And then this is, like I said, this is a schwa. So we know that it's an RE because we know that's the prefix, but it sounds like a R. And in referee, now that E is an E, right? We've totally changed the pronunciation. We now have a short E here. Now the schwa is in the middle, and we have this thing stuck on the end. Maybe we've never noticed that EE before. Maybe that's a suffix. Maybe that could be another whole investigation. So I didn't have it in here, so let me go back, because what I was thinking was, if you notice, ENT, ENCE. So that's something that you'll notice when you study words, that ENT and that ENCE hang out together, much like an ANT and an ANCE would hang out together. Here is, again, not exhaustive, but a nice visual representation. And from this, you could use that to build lots of these words however you want, whether you want to practice doing word sums or whether you want to use it as a spelling test. But it shows you how you can expose students to all the different prefixes and suffixes. And maybe you only do a few of them. Maybe you only do the ED, the ING, and the S, and maybe you only do a couple of the prefixes. Or maybe they're familiar with most of these, and then you can do this nice big word sum. There's something else I'm going to go back to the different after I do this slide. So we're going to investigate words. And when we investigate words, we're going to look at word families. So here's an example. Here's our word, GROW. That's our base. We can build lots of other words off of it. Maybe you've never thought of the TH as a suffix, but you can see it in growth. Maybe you never thought of the N as a suffix, but it's in something like I have grown. And if you've never seen those before, maybe again, those branch off into their own investigations. Well, do we see other words doing that, and what's going on in their families? We don't have an ED in here. Why not? Well, because the past tense looks different. The form is different, right? So we can put that out here because it doesn't have the same form, but it's certainly related. So we can put it in the circle. So that's our word family, and you can have morphological relatives, which have the same form, or you could have etymological relatives or semantic relatives that are related in other ways. But then what becomes even more important is looking across families to learn more about the system. So if we look at the system, look what we find. There's fall and fell and fallen. So if I did a matrix with FALL, I could put falls and falling and fallen, but I wouldn't have an ED, right? Because the past tense is fell. I noticed the same thing with run and ran, right? So this is the past tense, it's not an ED. I see the same thing with shake and shook and shaken. So this one has an N suffix. These have EN suffixes. This one already has an N on the end. And what's happening with these past tenses? I see here, I'm going from an O to an E. Here I'm going from an A to an E, a U to an A. Here I'm going from an A, a long A, to an So maybe I'm noticing something about the whole system. Maybe there's a different way to mark past tense besides ED. it looks like there can be a vowel change. And when you have that vowel change, look at what happens to the past participle. I see another pattern. I see something going on with an N or an EN. And I can look at a lot of different word families and see what I can find about the system. I can have an understanding, and if I run into something else that doesn't fit that understanding, I might have to refine it. But I've come across something by looking across the word families and looking at the pattern when I look across word families. And what I was going to say, oh, so an example for this would be, if you look here, what do you notice about refer and reference and referred? So here, there's a double R, but here, there's not. So we see something, and maybe it doesn't fit with our understanding about doubling. So maybe we need to look at another couple word families and see if we can figure out what's happening and how we can refine our understanding of the doubling rule so that it works for this family as well. Okay. So let's go back over our goals. So the difference between phonics and phonology. So you might want to pause it and see if you can talk about what the difference is between phonics and phonology. But we talked about the difference between phonology, which is the psychological representation, the shared psychological representation that we all have in our heads that's based on the language that we speak. And it kind of changes as we learn how to spell and we make the association between graphemes and phonemes, right? It's descriptive, though, because we're studying the words as they exist, and we're trying to make that association between the letters that are in the word and what they're spelling. Whereas phonics is prescriptive. The perfect example would be like a CH, right? So you teach CH, it's a digraph, it says ch. That's what most phonics programs are going to teach kids when they're young. And then later well, not even later. I mean, a word like Christmas, right? I mean, as soon as they start to go spell the word Christmas, well, what's going on there? There's a CH. It's not a ch. Why is there a CH and it's not a ch? So not only can CH spell different sounds, it can represent different phonemes. It can be a k, or it can be a ch, or it can be a sh. When we use the CH for those different sounds, it's driven by the history of the word. That's why the etymology matters. And if you flip it, if you have a ch, is it always going to be a ch? No. There are other letters that can spell ch, right? So why would we set kids up to think that there's this relationship, this one-to-one relationship? Ch says ch and ch is ch, when that's not true. And you can easily see it when you look at words that have that spelling. So it's the difference between studying what's actually going on in the word and the word family and using these prescriptive rules that don't apply to so many of the words in our language. Okay, what does linguistics tell us about written language, right? So what did we learn about written language? So we learned that written language, the whole purpose is to convey meaning, right? And it's really important as you develop as a reader that you're thinking about meaning both when you're reading and you're writing. And how are you going to do that? You're going to do that by focusing on processing the whole word and seeing the structure and understanding the pieces. Do you need grapheme phoneme correspondences? Sure. And are you going to use that as part of your investigation? Of course. And you're going to do it within a family, and you're going to look across families, and you're going to learn all kinds of things about the actual relationships between the graphemes and the phonemes. And why should we use the scientific method to investigate written language, right? So we should use it because that is how we're going to understand a rule-governed system. And that is how we're going to keep refining our own understanding as we go. And it's how we're going to teach our brain to think critically and to look for evidence and to, I mean, you can apply that to anything, but especially with reading and writing. It's not about perfect spelling, and it's not about guessing the correct spelling or guessing the word by sounding out, right? So it's really about understanding this process and how we're going to use that to investigate the writing. So in conclusion, you're going to see a theme here. The purpose of the writing system is to convey meaning. Comprehension and vocabulary development. So I didn't talk a whole lot about it here and there, but it depends on meaning. It's really important to comprehension and vocabulary development to have these associations between the written form and the meaning, and to have these associations between words that are related. I mean, if you want to learn a new word and it's related to a word you already know, then that's huge. You have a framework and a context to put that new meaning into. Trying to memorize definitions for vocabulary is not very helpful. But if you can actually find relatives that you already know, that's and then you have a way to store and encode that information in a related way, that's going to make a huge difference. Relying on decoding obscures meaningful structures, right? So you don't want to rely on decoding when you get to complex words. Complex meaning more than just a base, right? When you have more than just a base, you're gonna have to be able to see the structure. And grapheme choices are based on history and relatives. So like I said with the CH, why do we use a CH when it's a K? It's probably a Greek word. If it's sh, probably a modern French word. So it's important to understand that, and then you understand why the word is spelled the way that it is, and you can find lots of other words that are probably related to that word or have the same kind of grapheme choice, but it's based on the history and the relatives. That's the etymological piece, right? That's why, and that's how you understand markers that don't spell phoneme. There are so many jobs of letters in words that don't have to do with the phonology and the pronunciation. And morphemes are based on meaning, right? So there is, a level of language processing, receptive language processing, where your brain understands these pieces. And it's why you can make a plural or make a past tense out of a nonsense word, because you understand these pieces and you understand that they have a job and they have a meaning. And the more you study words, the more you understand the relationship of these morphemes to the meaning of the word. So here are the resources that I was talking about for investigating written language. So you have the etymological dictionary, which is Etymonline. Oh, sorry, so many typos. I don't know why that's there. I have to take that out. The word searcher, which is, if I say, hey, there's an FER in this word, what other words might have an FER? I can type them into the word searcher and I can get a list of FER words. Now, it doesn't mean every word in there is going to be a relative, but I might see ones that have an FER that seem related, and I can look them up in Etymonline and see if they have the same history. And then if you want to make a matrix, you can use the mini matrix maker. I personally just like to Google mini matrix maker. That's the easiest way to find it. Some other resources, Gina Cook's website, she's Lex. She has a lot of blogs that you can read. She has a lot of products that you can buy, a lot of classes you can take. She is definitely an expert on orthographic phonology. She is a linguist that studies orthography. Pete Bowers, he does a lot of classes. He has a workbook. He has a lot of blog information, and he's really instrumental, I think, in helping people understand how to use the word investigation process. And he talks a lot about, spelling out and using word zoms and kind of how to use them in the classroom. Here's some information about my info, the website, the email, the Facebook, and the end. Thank you so much for joining me, and hopefully I'll see you guys again next year. Thanks.